Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Here we are again. Thank you for joining me at my Australian bar. Another episode of Scandal Mongers podcast with me, Phil Craig. Yes, so last week I read a little extract from my book, Introduce You to a Character, Angela Noblet, a nurse. And several of you were really kind and said, do read more, Phil. So do you know what? I don't take much encouragement, so I will. Just a little extract before we go to the main interview. But the main event is Carolyn Harris is back, our favourite Canadian connoisseur of consorts and royal histories and royal lives, and especially the lives of royal women. And as a lot of you will remember, Carolyn is incredibly entertaining and knowledgeable, but she does not do short answers. So I'm anticipating a longish interview, so I will keep my introduction short. Really pleased about last week's show. Got loads of new commentators I'd not seen. I think maybe Sathnam Sangara his name attracted people to the podcast for the first time. Thank you if you've stayed around. Interesting conversation about empire and very pertinent to the book, my book, which I keep talking about and will do for another few weeks because it's coming out on April 24th, 2025, which is now about a month away. And actually, the next time you see me, I may have a copy in my hot, excited little hands. In fact, I think I'll cover the whole bar with them. Yes, currently, I think the one has arrived at the publishers and the rest are coming off the production line somewhere. In Australia too, actually, there'll be hard copies available soon in India, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. Not in America yet, although I do live in hope. If the book does well, it might get a deal for America and Canada. Anyway, update on the comments. Love to do this. Like I say, a lot of people joined us, perhaps who were new to the podcast, attracted by the subject matter, and some very interesting and intelligent comments. And not everybody agreed with me or Sathnam. And as you know, I don't mind a bit of disagreement. In fact, I think the art of civilized disagreement is something that we're losing, and we shouldn't. So, hello, Rohan Fernando, who said, enjoyed the programme, but disagreed with quite a lot of what Mr. Sangara says. Yes, the British made fortunes from crops, but those crops made money for the people of the colony and they're important to the economy of these places today. Well, they are. That's true. It wasn't all black and white. Any discussion about empire involves a balance of what the colonising power gave to the place and the people, and also what it took, and sometimes the damage it inflicted. That could be damage in terms of, cruelty to people. It could be economic damage, stopping development, perhaps not intervening quickly enough when bad things happen. But it's never a zero-sum game. There's a very healthy and active debate about empire, which I'm going to be a part of in my new book, The Pros and the Cons. Anyway, thank you, Rohan Fernando. Freaky1972. Freaky. I don't think I've seen you on here before. I would remember, I'm sure. Freaky is Malaysian. As a Malaysian who had members of my family killed by the communists during the emergency/civil war, I was irritated by this gentleman saying that that these people were freedom fighters. We think they're terrorists. Well, again, this is a very complicated one. In the decades after the Second World War, nationalism and communism got enmeshed, especially in the Far East. I think most famously in Vietnam, and maybe people in the West, certainly America, when it looked at Vietnam, only saw communists rather than seeing some of the people they'd fought alongside, actually, in the Second World War, who were just really nationalists. It's very complicated. And in Malaya, even more so, because, yes, the emergency, the Civil War, a lot of Malayans were on the side of the British. Some of them wanted the British to leave, but they didn't want us to leave like that, and they didn't want us to leave by kicked out by the communists. So, an interesting debate, which I enjoyed. I've enjoyed a lot of the comments this week, actually. It engaged with people. Almi3767. Hello, Almi. I love your show, Phil. Good way to start. Thank you. Please give the name and title of the nurse's diary. Yeah, this is the nurse, Angela Noblet, who was a character in my book, one of many, one of my favourites. I think I mentioned I sort of fell a little bit in love with her, even though, of course, we've never met. Actually, she's been dead quite a long time. But she wrote this very vivid diary, which really takes you into the atmosphere of 1940s and the war. And it's very modern in her take, very her sensibility. It feels like she could have written it 20 years ago, not 80. Anyway, yes, Angela Noblet. Her book, if you can find it, it's long since out of print. It's written later in her life when she was called Angela Bolton, and it's called A Maturing Son. But you'll get all the best bits in my book, which will be freely available very soon. Anyway, it's the end of March. Comment of the month. JM162, are you listening? You often do. Hello, JM162. Well, you've got yourself a mug. For many comments, actually, you've entertained me with loads of comments on lots of shows. But the one that stands out was a couple of weeks ago when I put on my Meghan wig, which most people, I think, enjoyed. Not everybody. I put on my Meghan Markle wig. And you just said, "Oh, Phil, you are naughty," with lots and lots of emojis. And I enjoyed that. It made me smile, and you're going to get a mug. So if you look on the bio of the program, there's a link. You can send an email to the show. It'll find its way to me, and then I will get you a lovely mug, which can be naughty. It can be naughty boy, naughty girl. I think we also have Another Day, Another Scandal, Let's Get Scandalous, various slogans that are amusing. Catherine the Great. Yes, that's what you're here for. Catherine the Great and Carolyn Harris. Not a huge amount to say. I mean, she's such a famous historical figure, perhaps, well, one of the most famous women in history. And certainly one of the most successful queens, empresses. But also, of course, her life is remembered and is recently sort of celebrated in a very historically dodgy way in that great series called The Great, where Elle Fanning plays her. Which brings to life some of the kind of salacious side of the Russian court. And as we'll discover, a lot of that is based on fact. I mean, Catherine has an extremely colourful love life throughout her long reign, and she's still picking up lovers well into her 60s. And the lovers are often a lot younger. So yeah, she's remembered for sexual scandal, but actually she should really be remembered as a really amazing woman, in very much a man's world, becoming one of Europe's greatest leaders and really transforming the world and the nation she led, redrawing the borders of Europe, which, as we'll discover when we talk to Carolyn, some of the borders that Catherine the Great set are still contentious today, especially in Ukraine and Crimea. I think that's enough from me. Oh, wait a minute. What are you doing, Phil? You're forgetting the reading. Yes, do jump ahead to the interview if you want, but I did promise a bit more of Angela. So for those who remember, I introduced her in the little reading I did about, she's a nurse, she falls in love with the commander, actually, of the hospital that she's based in, a man called Edward Lossing. And various things happen, various adventures and scares, and dealing with the reality of war, and her very, very good and interesting take on what she sees. I mentioned last week that she sort of witnesses the Bengal famine firsthand. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. They're now engaged. We're now in 1944, or maybe the beginning of 1945, and she's got this amazing job. She distinguishes herself so much on the wards, dealing with the kind of crisis casualty care. They give her this dream posting on what's called a river steamer. They have these ambulance boats that sail up and down various rivers in India and taking soldiers from frontline casualty stations to bigger hospitals down south. And the trains are not always running, and it's a much nicer way to transport people. And they can take, I think, about 100, 120 wounded men. And sometimes they're actually Japanese as well. It's usually British, occasionally American. And she's got a job on this boat. And it's a wonderful community, and she really describes it beautifully. You get a sense of her character. I'm just going to read a few paragraphs just to get you into the mood of Angela and her world when she's serving on this river steamer, this river ambulance, hospital ship, I guess I should call it. On board the steamer, Angela made what she called her first native friend, a fellow nurse from Goa called Mary de Souza. Mary instructed her in Urdu and taught her how to wear a sari and dance to Indian music, much to the delight of the crew and the other Indian nurses and doctors on board. During the long, warm evenings, the women would sit together gazing out at the lights in riverside huts, which looked like nests at the foot of mop-headed palms and sampans silhouetted against the primrose sky. As plunging birds dived for fish, they'd speak for hours under the stars of everything and of nothing. Angela was very proud of the nursing on the river, and she enjoyed seeing the weak and desperate men in her care transform. There was a shortage of qualified doctors, and so Indian licensates, partly trained medical staff, worked on the steamer too. One evening, as a soldier with cerebral malaria was slipping into a coma, one such young doctor had a crisis of confidence, and he held back from administering the intravenous quinine that Angela, from painful experience, knew was the soldier's only hope. Quote, "As we stood there looking at the patient by the dim rays of a kerosene lamp, it suddenly dawned on me that he had never given an intravenous injection before." She took his hand and encouraged him to try, and another life was saved on the river. The recovering patients and the general bonhomie made it a very happy ship and a very hopeful time, and she was able to learn much about the state of the war. Quote, "I sat today with men from the Lancashire Fusiliers who came up onto the serving hatch for a rum ration and a good old deco and a real British female. They tell me how in the jungle it's the brew-ups and the fags that make life bearable, and they long for the airdrops that bring them canned fruit, rum and cigarettes, mostly American." The calmness and the camaraderie of days and nights like these touched Angela deeply, as did the friendships and romances she witnessed between men and women of very different races, faiths and backgrounds. Her hand on that of the nervous young doctor, wheeling around the deck in her sari in front of her cheering friends, reciting Urdu poetry up towards the stars, all of it combined into a vision of a better world, an antidote to all the inequalities and abuse that she'd witnessed elsewhere. In her diary late one night, perhaps after one of those moonlight dances with her friends, she sat down and wrote, "Ahead of us curves the moon, a single thread of light flanked by a single star, which proclaims to the Muslim world the advent of Eid al-Fitr and the end of the long fast. The sky is a lucent indigo, drawing its light from the increasing stars rather than the fragile moon. Like the new fire of Easter in the Western world, this festival speaks to us of a fresh start in light, a fresh start in life, a time for hope, a time for trust, a time for the future." But despite feeling so hopeful and so sentimental, of her fiancé, she wrote nothing. Trouble's brewing, I think, in Angela's life, or at least in her relationship. Anyway, that's enough. Another little taster from the book. I'll stop talking now, and we can jump to Carolyn, and I will see you at the end of that, which I think will not be a short interview. Thanks for bearing with me. Bye. Carolyn, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me back. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, you have many fans. People keep saying, "When's Carolyn coming back?" So we want to hear about Catherine
audience.
the Great.
Everyone says such nice things.
They are a good bunch, I think. Yes, so where to start? Catherine the Great. Scandal, yes. Intrigue, plots, assassinations, massive changes, the Enlightenment. But basically remembered in pop culture for a lurid sex story about a horse.
Yeah, that story, there is no historical basis for that. Certainly, there were many men in Catherine the Great's life, and she enjoyed equestrian activities, and that led to some lurid rumors that have no basis in reality. And there's a few rumors from Catherine the Great's time that were invented or exaggerated because she was a ruler who took her place on the world stage and was shaping events in Europe. So Catherine the Great as a ruler, but also Catherine the Great as a woman received a great deal of scrutiny, both within Russia, despite her efforts to try to control public opinion, but also more widely in Europe, that she was very much a power player in European politics.
Well, when we spoke about Marie Antoinette, another significant figure who was the subject of all sorts of smears by her opponents. And yes, no doubt because she was a woman, a lot of these were about her supposed sexual antics, most of which were invented. Um, let's go back to the beginning because I guess it's a story of another German princess, isn't it?
Yes, it's interesting that there's this interconnected network of German royalty in what was then the Holy Roman Empire that supplied a lot of the husbands and wives of European monarchs. So it's interesting, Catherine the Great and Queen Victoria shared a matrilineal ancestor. So there's very much this network of European royal houses, some of which were quite powerful. We think of the electors in Germany who elected the Holy Roman Emperor, these major figures in Prussia and Saxony and Hanover. And then there's Catherine the Great's family, that she was the daughter of the Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, which was a tiny little garrison town outside of Prussia. Her father could ride across his domains in a single day. This was a very small and insignificant place within this wider Holy Roman Empire, but she's well connected. Her mother, Johanna, was closely connected to the Swedish royal family. In fact, one of Catherine the Great's cousins and rivals was, Gustav III of Sweden. And they were very much seen as a client state by Frederick the Great in Prussia, and that would have a very strong impact on Catherine's standing. And for Catherine in her youth, she was born Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst. She doesn't take the name Catherine until she marries and converts to Russian Orthodoxy. And then she takes the name of Peter the Great's second wife, I guess, who would have been her late grandmother-in-law at that time. And so growing up, her mother was very much disappointed that she was not a boy, and she suffered from some health issues. She had scoliosis and had to wear a brace for her spine. And actually, the town executioner was brought to look at her spine, as he was the person who knew the most about anatomy, in
Oh my
order to have
goodness.
a look at
What a
her
time to
spine.
be alive. Yeah, she was a bit
Oh
of a
yeah, what
tom.
a time to be alive,
She
being
was
born in
seen as a bit of a.
1729.
She was seen
And
as being quite outgoing, wasn't she? She trained to master a sword, according to one account I read. And they taught her French. They clearly had ambition for her.
yes, she had a very accomplished governess who she called Madame Babette, who taught her French. She became an accomplished equestrian, as we have already discussed. There's a determination to succeed, perhaps because her sickly younger brother was so favored by their mother that she was quite determined to stand out and succeed. And what's interesting is that the very insignificance of Anhalt-Zerbst meant that for Empress Elizabeth of Russia, the daughter of Peter the Great, who'd come to the throne in a military coup in 1741, that she saw a young Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst as a suitable wife for her nephew and heir, the future Peter III, a grandson of Peter the Great, simply because an insignificant place like this, there wouldn't be any problems, there wouldn't be demands, that there was the idea that little Sophia, later Catherine's parents, would simply be grateful she'd been chosen for this exalted destiny. And certainly her mother was grateful. Her
Yeah,
father was less.
it's marrying up, isn't it? I mean,
Yes,
it's
it's
quite.
marrying up in a big way. Her father was less pleased, though, because the marriage would require a conversion to the Russian Orthodox religion. So, her father being Lutheran, he did not
Hmm.
accompany his wife and daughter to Russia. That he seems to have been against this, but her mother seems to have prevailed that this was a big opportunity. And so, rather like Marie Antoinette at a very young age, that when she's just 15, young Sophia arrives in Russia at the court of the Empress Elizabeth, and she meets her future husband, who's also a young teenager. And at first, they seem to at least have a rapport as friends, if not as a romantic connection, because they were both German. Elizabeth's sister Anna had married the Duke of Holstein and had died in childbirth, giving birth to the future Peter III. So he'd spent his early youth in Germany as Duke of Holstein. Sophie was from Anhalt-Zerbst. And so at first, they're two teenagers chatting in German and are able to form a rapport, but the problems ensue in that the future Peter III absolutely hated life in Russia. He didn't like the Russian Orthodox Church. He preferred German military traditions to Russian ones. He idolized Frederick the Great as his hero. Whereas Sophie very quickly converts to Russian Orthodoxy. She takes the name Catherine, and she stays up so late learning Russian that she caught pneumonia in one of those drafty palaces. And she
Hmm.
made sure that was known to the Empress Elizabeth, that she was so committed to her new role. So it's interesting. There are many
Yeah,
foreign
she
princesses.
seems to get on better with her mother-in-law than her husband after a
Yes, her
while.
aunt-in-law. Yes, yes.
Aunt-in-law.
That she got along very well at first with Empress Elizabeth, simply because the now Catherine was determined to embrace this role and become more Russian than the Russians. And Empress Elizabeth was an interesting blend of contradictions. She was the daughter of Peter the Great, and Peter the Great, some second wife, who, as we discussed, is also a Catherine. And Elizabeth had been raised with a very European education because her father had hoped she would marry Louis XV, and that did not happen. But she grows up speaking French and dancing very well. But Elizabeth had also had Russian peasant nannies and was very steeped in old Russian traditions. So we see Empress Elizabeth was somebody who could dance all night at a ball and then be on her knees in prayer and going on pilgrimages to Russian Orthodox convents. So Elizabeth captured a lot of the contradictions of Russia after the age of Peter the Great, where there's this veneer of European culture in St. Petersburg, the new capital, and in Moscow. But there's also this centuries of tradition and the rather unchanging lives of the peasantry, many of whom were serfs. So
Hmm.
for Catherine observing this, she was seeing that Elizabeth was very much a blend of European sophistication, but also the importance of connecting with these older Russian traditions. So, unlike the future Peter III, who had nothing but disdain for his new life in Russia, Catherine embraced this and became more Russian than the Russians, and really sublimating that German heritage of hers. And that's not a balance a lot of foreign princesses achieve.
No,
There
I'm
were many
sure. And how
there
did
were
they
many
get
who were
on?
always
And
associated with the place of their birth.
I think they're married, aren't they? It's just 16 or 17.
Yes,
So they
she's
have a
just
year to get to
16.
know each other. They get married. Doesn't go terribly well, does it, at first?
No, it goes very badly. They're married in 1745 when Catherine is just 16. She wears a comparatively simple dress and unpowdered hair at the wedding. And by now, relations with her soon to be husband, that had started at least cordial, if not romantic, had gone downhill. And Catherine admits in her memoirs that she reacted with revulsion after Peter experienced smallpox and was horribly scarred, and she admits that she reacted with horror. So he seems to have rejected her as well. And so Elizabeth was determined that they have an heir. You know, this was her late sister's son, is the last of the descendants of Peter the Great. And so essentially, the future Peter III and his wife Catherine are being locked in a bedroom together every night, in which he would play with his toy soldier formations or his dogs, or he'd play the violin. Catherine never liked music, perhaps because of all this time with her husband
So
playing the
she's
violin
keen.
badly.
She wants to conceive. She wants to
Yes, she
do
wants to have an
her
heir.
job.
So he's ignoring her,
Right.
devoting himself to his violin and his military formations.
A
And
bizarre idea, though, isn't it? You're locked in a room and, darling, come to bed. No, I've got to sort out this division of lead soldiers. Weird.
oh, very much so. And
Do you
so she
believe
takes up.
that? Do you believe that is actually what happened?
Well, she describes this as a period where there was a lot of reading. She takes up Montesquieu and
I'm not
Voltaire, and this is her
surprised.
Enlightenment education. So she read books while he lined up his formations. And I think part of this was just how young they were. Like Louis
Hmm.
XVI and Marie Antoinette, there's a certain degree of awkwardness that they're being forced into this situation. But I think also she had been revolted by him, and so a little like Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves, where it's clear Anne of Cleves wasn't too impressed with Henry, so he's saying that this woman pleaseth me not. I think they got off on the wrong foot there, and years go by without an heir. And Catherine's in a very difficult situation. She's trying to curry favor among the courtiers, but if she doesn't have a son, this marriage could be annulled and she could be sent home. It's the same pressures that were faced by Marie Antoinette. And Empress Elizabeth was trying everything. She assigned them a governor and governess who had 8 children to hopefully point the young couple in the right direction. It's interesting considering Catherine's later reputation that her late teens seem to have been this celibate, frustrating time in her life where she concentrated on her reading and court activities.
Does Peter
And
have
then,
anybody else in his life? Does Peter have like a
yeah,
mistress or?
yes, Peter did find a mistress, Elizabeth of Vorontsov, who once he becomes the Tsar, he wants to put Catherine aside so that he can marry her. And it's interesting, Elizabeth Vorontsov's sister, Catherine Dashkova, was actually one of Catherine's great adherents when she stages her coup. So families were divided in terms of who was on Team Peter III versus
Team
Team
Catherine.
Catherine in this very difficult marriage. And what ultimately happens is Catherine does give birth to a son in 1754, the future Emperor Paul, and we still don't know who the father was. It may have been her first lover, Sergei Saltykov, and certainly that was widely rumored at the time. Catherine implies in her memoirs that may have been the case. However, as this boy grew up, he developed a bit of an obsession with military formations and he began looking like Peter III. And Catherine was always distant with her son, sort of revolted by him almost, which may imply that this wasn't the son of a handsome court dandy, but that she and her husband realized they weren't going to get out of that locked bedroom until there was an heir. And what's very traumatic for Catherine is she gives birth to a son, and Empress Elizabeth confiscates her little grandnephew. And Catherine describes being left in this drafty room on the soiled sheets where she'd just given birth. Everyone had forgotten about her. She'd produced the baby had been taken to the Empress, and she lies there for hours waiting for someone to notice and clean her up and look after her. And it's more than a week before she's even allowed to see her sons. That may also have been why she becomes quite emotionally detached from her son, that Elizabeth, feeling as though she failed with her nephew, the future Peter III, decides that she's going to raise her
Mm.
grandnephew. And Catherine repeats that pattern. She will confiscate her grandsons, the future Alexander I and Grand Duke Constantine, and raise them herself. So sadly, that pattern gets repeated later in Catherine's reign.
How many years pass between the birth of this child of questionable parentage and the really big falling out where basically there's a coup? Is it
Well, a few more years pass. Sergei Saltykov is sent on a diplomatic mission, so Catherine's first lover is out of her life. She moves on to another man, Stanislaus Potanowski, who would go on to be the last king of Poland, and he shared her Enlightenment interests, and he is likely the father of her daughter, who dies in infancy. And then what happens in 1761 in December is Empress Elizabeth dies during the 7 Years' War, in which that new alliance between France and Austria that would lead to the marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, Russia was backing France and Austria against Prussia. So the Russian troops were very close to getting to loot and pillage in Berlin. It looked like everything was over for Frederick the Great. However, the death of Empress Elizabeth means Peter III succeeds to the throne, and Frederick the Great is his hero, and he
wow?
brings back the Russian troops. There's a lot of unhappy officers who thought the looting and pillaging was imminent, and now they're being brought back by a new emperor who wants them all to wear German uniforms and march in German formation. Also, during the funeral rituals for Empress Elizabeth, Catherine is very careful to observe all of them, to spend days in prayer, whereas Peter III is openly mocking the Russian Orthodox Church and making fun of the priests and generally
Uh-oh.
behaving like a spoiled child through all of this. And so Catherine, who by now, there's another man in her life, Gregory Orlov, a military officer. His brothers are quite powerful figures in the Russian guards at that time. The military begins to look to Catherine not necessarily as empress in her own right, but thinking if Peter III were moved along, perhaps she could be regent for her young son. And Catherine's careful to be cagey about her intentions. She has no intention of being her son's regent and to be a kind of figurehead, for the Russian
And we
nobility or
know
the
this
Russian.
from her own memoir. She genuinely wanted to kind of get rid of
Yes.
him,
She
side with the army, become all powerful herself.
Yes, and she felt she had no choice. She was in a very delicate situation at the time of Empress Elizabeth's death. She's pregnant with a secret child by Gregory Orlov, and by this time, there's no chance of passing Peter III off as the father. And she could disguise this to some degree. 18th century skirts, you could hide a lot of things there. But then, when the time came to go into labor, only a few of her servants knew, and she knew her husband Peter III was obsessed with fires and firefighting. You found that interesting. So she basically paid one of her servants to burn down his own house. So Peter III and his court will be out watching the firefighting. And then she has a little boy, Alexei Bobrinsky. And it's not known if Peter III knew what was happening while he was out watching the firefighting. The baby was smuggled out to a noble foster family. Paul I would give him the title of Count as his half brother later in the next reign. But certainly Peter III begins to talk about putting Catherine in a convent, the traditional way Russian rulers got rid of unwanted wives. Peter the Great had done this to his first wife, and then marrying his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. So Catherine, having just had a secret child and has had that scandal that has been hushed up, it seems that at any moment she could be locked away in a convent and
So
her
it's her
husband
or
would.
him. Somebody's going to have to make the
Yeah,
first move.
somebody's got to go. It's her or him. And she's got all these discontented military officers who are furious at the way Peter III is governing and how he's behaved in the 7 Years' War when they had that chance of victory. And so the Orlov brothers and her friend Princess Dashkova, the sister of Peter III's mistress, who had all these connections at court, help to engineer a coup. And she's able to seize power relatively quickly. Princess Dashkova also wrote a memoir describing the cheering military, the Russian Orthodox Church, who are very quick to acclaim her. Some eyebrows are raised when she's declared empress rather than regent for her son, who's now 8 years old by this time. But Frederick the Great comments with Peter III that he'd been deposed like a child being sent off to bed, that Frederick the Great was struck by how quickly this had happened and how quickly Peter III had been deprived of his throne. And Peter III, who never wanted to be Tsar of Russia, just asked to be sent back to Holstein and he could be Duke there. But of course, Catherine can't have a rival emperor there.
So what
And
happens to poor old Peter?
what happens to poor old Peter? He's handed over to Catherine's lover, Gregory Orlov, and his brothers to imprison him. But Catherine must have known that although Peter was no longer Tsar, he was still her husband, and Gregory Orlov wanted to be her husband. So she was handing him over to people who had a motive to get rid of him. And what Gregory Orlov's brother, Alexei Orlov, tells her is that there was a fight and he was accidentally killed. So Catherine's given plausible deniability, and she will later tell other European
Is this a bit
leaders,
like people in modern Russia falling out of
yeah,
windows? Do you
yes,
think?
it's a little like falling out a window in modern Russia, that he seems to have been quietly smothered, and the Orlov brothers presented it as a fight. And Catherine told the rest of Europe that he died of a hemorrhoidal colic, so she didn't even really give him a dignified exit. And that became a euphemism in the 18th century for a political murder. The Enlightenment philosopher D'Alembert joked that he would never visit Russia because he was prone to hemorrhoids and he'd heard they were fatal there. So Catherine, when she was trying to present herself as an
Yes.
Enlightenment
We
ruler
like
to
to
the
get to the
rest.
bottom of the big historical stories on this
Yes, we get to the
podcast.
bottom of the big historical
Sorry, I couldn't
stories, but this
resist.
was the story Catherine gave of what had happened to her husband, who had been quietly disposed of by the
Oh,
Orlov
goodness
brothers.
me.
And then there's another rival who's disposed of. Empress Elizabeth, when she'd come to the throne in 1741, she had overthrown the infant Ivan VI, who was a descendant of Peter the Great's brother, Ivan V. And this poor child had basically grown up in isolation at Schlüsselburg Fortress. Peter III had visited him and had found this young man who was able to say, I'm here because I'm the emperor, and that's why I can't go outside, but otherwise seemed to have the mind of a child. And Catherine gave the orders if anyone tried to help him to escape, he was to be killed. And that's exactly what happens. There's an effort to liberate by, it seems, it wasn't a big plot. It seems to have been a lone actor who tries to liberate Ivan VI, this poor young man who's been in solitary confinement his whole life, and he is stabbed to death by his guards. So
Okay.
Catherine, on the one hand, she presents herself as an enlightened despot there to reform the law who knows what's best for her subjects. But also, there were two men with better claims to the Russian throne than she did, who were disposed of quite early in her reign. So she could be very ruthless when she felt she needed to be.
So she's got power. She's still quite
Yes.
young. She's got the
Hmm.
world
Yeah,
at
in
her
her
feet.
30s.
What does she want to do with this power?
Well, at first, she's quite interested in reforming the law code. She is part of this generation of enlightened despots. Joseph II, Marie Antoinette's brother, described this as everything for the people, nothing by the people. The idea that these rulers are so well educated that they know what's best for their subjects. So Catherine the Great takes that approach. She assembles a great committee of representatives from all of the different levels of the Russian state, the clergy, the nobility, even the peasantry, to hear their grievances. So there's this early part of her reign where she presents herself as quite an enlightened ruler, but a problem ensues. Catherine, as an Enlightenment ruler, she'd like to abolish serfdom. But that's not possible. She has been placed in power by military officers, nobles, churchmen who all own serfs. The state owns serfs that undertake building projects in St. Petersburg, for instance. And if she were to liberate the serfs, she'd find herself overthrown very quickly and replaced by her son with a regent who would keep the prerogatives of the nobility there. So she ultimately decides she's not in a strong enough position to introduce that level of social change in society. So it will be left to one of her descendants, to Alexander II, in 1861 to ultimately free the serfs long after serfdom had been abolished elsewhere in Europe. So Catherine finds some of her Enlightenment projects on a grand scale, on a great scale. This is when she gets the nickname Catherine the Great, when she assembles this committee to reform the law code, that she finds that this is less possible in the circumstances she's in. She has more success in her building projects in St. Petersburg. She's a great patron of neoclassical art, whereas Empress Elizabeth had enjoyed the Baroque architectural forms that were much more showy. Catherine preferred neoclassicism and the pillars, with the architecture. Catherine also founds, the famous girls' school, the Smolny Institute, that will educate young noble women all the way up until the Russian Revolution, when it becomes Lenin's headquarters at that time. And most famously, she accumulates a massive art collection for Russia that becomes the Hermitage Museum, not in her time. As we can tell, Hermitage is a word for a place where a hermit lived. She did not
Mm.
intend for this to be a public gallery. She intended this to be a place where she would contemplate the art that she'd accumulated. But her grandson, Nicholas I, in the early 19th century, will turn this into the public museum that
And,
continues to
and
exist
meanwhile,
to the
Russia
present.
is expanding. I mean, whether it's her or her generals or her
Yes,
ministers, Russia has a very successful era of
yes,
basically grabbing a lot of territory, and
yes.
we're living with the consequences of that still.
Yes, she set some very key precedents in Russian foreign policy that are still playing out to the present day. Despite the wishes of Gregory Orlov, who, having disposed of her husband, hoped that he would be her next husband, she's advised by senior nobles that Madame Orlov can never be the Empress of Russia. So Orlov is given a pension, a house. he is sent on his way. Catherine always liked to remain on good terms with the men who had been in her life. She didn't like there to be conflict there. She later commented that if she'd been given a husband who she could love, that she would have been faithful to him, that it was simply circumstances that led to the life she led. So the next man in her life, well, the next significant man in her life, Gregory Potemkin, is this great statesman who is a veteran of the Russo-Turkish Wars. And these are the conflicts that will lead to expansion in the south, that by 1783, Catherine has annexed the Crimea, the land of the Crimean Tatars, one of those last pieces of what had once been an enormous Mongol empire. And this is part of her public image as a Russian nationalist. She had to subsume all of that German background and present herself as more Russian than the Russians. So she has victories in the Crimea, and then in Western, on her Western front, which would have been the Eastern Front for the rest of Europe, she participates in the partition of Poland with Maria Theresa of Austria and Frederick the Great of Prussia, her former lover, Stanislaus Potonowski, who she once described as her wax doll because she could manipulate him in this role. He also wanted to marry her and combine Poland and Russia, but ultimately what happens is he's deposed once he's sort of served his purpose, and then Poland is partitioned. So Catherine the Great ends up gaining more and more territory, and all of this makes the Russian Empire a very diverse place. There are Crimean Tatars. There are Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians being added to the empire. She invites some German Mennonites to settle in what is now Ukraine, and many would live there until the revolution, when many would flee abroad, including to Canada. Jewish people, also settle in some of Catherine's new territories. So she's presenting herself as a kind of Russian nationalist, but at the same time, she's creating an empire that has many diverse communities in it that are not necessarily Orthodox Christian, but come from a very wide variety of backgrounds.
Is she popular? Is she popular with these people that she's conquering? Is she popular with the Russian masses at this time? Does it even matter if she's popular or not?
Well, her wars, of course, require a great deal of conscription, much of this from serfdom. And if you were called up as a serf recruit, that was 25 years, and that really meant that was the rest of your life, assuming you're called up when
Wow.
you're 20-ish. Your chances of making it to 45 as a serf recruit on the battlefield were very low. Your village would actually have a funeral ceremony for you if you were called up, that this was it. They were never going to see you again. So there was a lot of discontent among the lower classes because they thought serfdom was going to be abolished, and it wasn't. All of these wars required a great deal of peasant conscription. So in the 1770s and 1773, Catherine faces an enormous peasant revolt led by Emelian Pugachev, a Cossack who actually claims he's Peter III, that Peter III had never been murdered, and that he's back to get his throne from his faithless wife. And where he's recruiting people south of Moscow, no one's seen Peter III, so they're willing to accept this sort of swarthy Cossack as the emperor. And Russia has a very long tradition of this. When there's discontent with the czar or with the ruler, a claimant appearing during Russia's time of troubles from 1598 to 1613, false Dmitri I had briefly reigned in the Kremlin, claiming that he was Ivan the Terrible's youngest son who'd actually died as a child. And so this happens again and again, all the way to the Anastasia claimants of the 20th century after the Russian Revolution. There's a long tradition of claimants, and Pugachev is one of these. And he promises land for the peasants. He promises bread. He doesn't quite promise peace. This is still the 18th century, so it's not quite the program that will be presented by Lenin in 1917, but he promises that the land is going to be taken from the nobility, it's going to be given to the peasants. And Catherine, once again, who's cultivated this perception of herself as an enlightened ruler, that the rest of Europe is shocked by how harshly she puts down this rebellion. Once again, she doesn't quite order all the torture, but she sends generals who she knows will put this down very fiercely because they own those estates that Pugachev's threatening to take and give to the peasants. It's a little like the death of Peter III, of simply putting people who have the motive to behave brutally
Right.
in that role rather than being the one giving the orders. And Pugachev is quite brutally executed once he is apprehended. So this is the empress who started out as somebody who was going to free the serfs and be an enlightened ruler. That sadly she becomes known for annexing the Crimea, partitioning Poland, and putting down this Pugachev revolt extremely brutally. And the French Revolution in 1789 sours her on Enlightenment ideas to some degree. That she's horrified by what happens to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. A number of French emigres escaping the French court traveled to Catherine the Great's court, including Marie Antoinette's portrait painter, Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, that she tries to seek her fortune at Catherine the Great's court and finds she has less success. Catherine the Great doesn't particularly admire the more informal, sentimental way that Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun paints, as Catherine always wanted to be perceived, as Minerva, as the goddess of wisdom, as this powerful figure. She doesn't want to be portrayed in this more romantic, sentimental light, and even objects to her young granddaughters being painted more informally. So all these French emigres are arriving, and Catherine becomes less patient with dissent, even among the kind of Enlightenment salons that she had once patronized. So at one point, it seemed as though, at least at the top, there was going to be greater freedom of expression. And the circumstances of the French Revolution lead to Catherine becoming more conservative, even more autocratic, and becoming disillusioned with a lot of these French ideas that she had been so enamored with in her
Well, she
youth.
was a friend or a correspondent with Voltaire, wasn't she?
Oh, yes,
So she
she
knew this
corresponded
stuff very
with
well.
Voltaire. Diderot acted as one of her agents, helping acquire some of that art for the
Amazing.
Hermitage. She had a very vast network of correspondence across Europe. Her first art collection, that became the nucleus of the Hermitage, was originally assembled for Frederick the Great, and she enjoyed being able to send a statement to Europe that she could afford that, and he couldn't after the 7 Years' War. She was taking that artwork. And then in Britain, she buys the Walpole collection, which had belonged to Britain's first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, who left a lot of debts. So his family were eager to unload this. And there was a parliamentary debate in Britain about this becoming the nucleus of a national gallery in London, that this shouldn't be going to Russia. But ultimately, Catherine makes a very big bid, and the Walpole collection travels to the Hermitage. She was also in competition with Gustav III of Sweden for who could collect the most classical statuary. This is the era when Pompeii is being excavated, so there's a huge explosion of interest in the classics. So she's a very well-educated person. She writes some translations and French-style comedies herself that were performed at court. So rather like Elizabeth I, she had a very wide range of different interests, but when it came to her political role, she was very quick to put down any dissent. And she certainly sidelines her son as he grows older and he wants more power, that she basically marries him off. He has 10 children, and she takes the two older sons to raise herself. She lets Paul keep his
So
daughters.
you mentioned the reputation that she had for taking a series of lovers.
Yes.
They would get something out of it. They
Hmm.
would land serfs, whatever.
Hmm.
She would take care of them, make sure they were happy at the end of the relationship. How normal was this? I mean, what did was it shocking? I mean, we all know that male rulers would have
Yes.
strings of mistresses, no doubt, and endless illegitimate children. But for a woman to behave like this, was that very unusual at the time?
Yes, it was very shocking, and certainly other female rulers found this notable, like Maria Theresa, for instance, the Empress of the Austrian Empire, that the Habsburg Empire, very much presented herself as a respectable wife and mother, married to Francis of Lorraine, has 16 children. And Maria Theresa found it difficult on a personal level to work with first Empress Elizabeth, who had many lovers. Elizabeth spent much of her life with a Ukrainian chorister, Alexei Razumovsky, who was known as the Emperor of the Night. And then there was Catherine the Great and all of the men in her life. And Maria Theresa found the behavior of her fellow female rulers to be quite shocking, as Maria Theresa clearly had the view that you had to be even more respectable than the men to be taken seriously. It's important to note that there were male rulers at this time who were judged on the basis of their personal lives. And I think Louis XV, who Empress Elizabeth had once hoped to marry, is a big example of this, that he was criticized for being managed by his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, who was also the big cultural influence at his court, patron of the Rococo style in art and architecture and furniture design. So Louis XV certainly received some condemnation. But when we look at the political cartoons in Europe, it shows it shows Catherine, spreading her legs over all of Europe, determined to consume the continent under her skirts. And as she grew older, the men in her life didn't seem to get older. I mean, Gregory Potemkin was 10 years younger than
Oh,
she
no
was.
man has ever behaved like that. No
Yeah,
man.
and yeah, there are lots of male European rulers who behaved like this, but when
So she's
60-year-old
taking.
Catherine
There was
had
this. I mean, there
20-year-old,
was. You mentioned the caricatures. I did look at some actually because
yeah,
they're quite naughty. A lot of these pictures.
yes,
And there's.
this is the age of political satire
Yeah,
that
well,
the
that's
Hanoverian
in Britain
monarchs are
too.
satirized as well.
But apparently, according to one of these cartoons, you can tell me if this is based on anything that was true, that she hired a woman, was it a countessa, to test out the men, and she was called the tester of male capacity, whatever that word is in Russian. And that so if you wanted to be a lover of the empress, you had to sleep with this woman first, and she'd mark you out of 10. Is there any truth in this? It sounds like an
That's a
extraordinary job.
This is another story that where also just like the story about the horse, where Catherine was an equestrian and she had men in her life, and all of this gets mashed together to form some rather sordid rumors. The story about her lady in waiting, Prascovia Bruce, who was married to the governor of St. Petersburg, who was the descendant of a Scottish general who had settled, and one of the many foreigners who'd been recruited by Peter the Great, that Prascovia Bruce was one of Catherine the Great's closest friends, that they had known each other since the time of Catherine's marriage, and Prascovia acted as the go-between when Catherine needed to send letters to Gregory Orlov and wanted to evade Empress Elizabeth. Prascovia Bruce was the one delivering these
Right.
letters. So we talk a lot about the men in Catherine's life. There are also some very important women, friends for different purposes. There was Catherine Dashkova for staging a coup, and there's Prascovia Bruce for keeping in touch with the lovers. And I think that because Prascovia Bruce was always running these letters back and forth to potential men, that fueled the idea that she was also testing out these men. And she was fired from her position as lady in waiting after being caught in a love affair with somebody who it seems that Catherine wanted. So all of
Okay.
this got mashed together to imagine that there was a naughty lady in waiting who was auditioning the men. Certainly, the men do seem to have received venereal disease checks from the court doctors, but whether Prascovia Bruce was actually testing them out, that seems to have been a salacious rumor that came from Prascovia's role as a kind of
Well,
go-between.
I'm
Somebody,
sure you've seen the Elle Fanning portrayal in that
yes,
comedy, The Great, which is gloriously unhistorical. But I guess those sort of
it's
stories are
described.
what those sort of stories sort of lay behind the way they present her in that show.
Well, The Great brings in a lot of creative anachronism in that there's a reference to a Chernobyl girls' choir that glows and a Moscow mule. And Catherine the Great in The Great with Elle Fanning references having met Descartes, but Descartes had died in 1690, long before Catherine was born.
Do you watch it?
Catherine
Do you like it? Is it entertaining, or do you think it's just a bit silly?
Well, what I find difficult for me watching it is because they make Peter the Third, in that he's Peter the Second, he's Peter the Great's son rather than his grandson. It eliminates Russia's age of empresses that preceded Catherine, and I think it's impossible to understand Catherine the Great without looking at the series of female rulers who came to the throne after Peter the Great's death. Peter the Great dies in 1725. He's succeeded by his widow, his second wife, until 1727. His niece reigns from 1730 to 1740. His daughter Elizabeth seizes the throne in 1741. So Catherine has this example of her aunt-in-law Elizabeth had seized the throne in a military coup, and I wonder if Catherine would have had the boldness as a minor German
Interesting.
princess to seize power if she hadn't been following in the footsteps of some very powerful women in Russia's history. So I do think the Greats, which is described as being an occasionally true story, and even that may be a little generous, that the Great, in condensing the characters and condensing the events and portraying everything is happening at the same time, we lose this really rich history of past, little known 18th century
So
female
probably
rulers.
of
And I
all the
think
countries of Europe, then Russia probably experienced at this time anyway more female rulers than anybody else.
yes, and all of these female rulers presented themselves as carrying on Peter the Great's legacy, as he died in 1725, saying, "Leave everything to," and he never finished that sentence. And a whole series of members of his extended family end up seizing the throne at various times. And it's these women who beautify St. Petersburg and create the city that exists today. Think of the Catherine Palace built by Empress Elizabeth and the Alexander Palace, which was a kind of starter palace for Catherine the Great's grandson, the future Alexander the First, the summer gardens, and also the ballet, the theater, all of these aspects that we see as quintessential Russian culture. It comes out of this period of the age of empresses. So Catherine the Great is the most well known of this series of female rulers, but I think Empress Elizabeth and Peter the Great's niece, who was another Anna, deserve to be well known as well. Peter the Great's niece sent Vitus Bering on his second expedition, where he basically claims Alaska for Russia, and it would be Russian America until 1867 when it sold to the United States. So I think this whole period of the age of empresses in the 18th century that unfolds between 1725 and Catherine the Great's death in 1796 deserves more attention. Peter the Great had two grandsons, Peter II and Peter III, and neither of them lasted very long. Peter II died of smallpox, and Peter III, as we discussed, was overthrown and disposed of
Those
later.
hemorrhoids again, they'll get you in the
Yep.
end.
Yeah.
But well, it's interesting because it must have been a thrilling time. I mean, they're getting Alaska, they're getting the Ukraine, they're getting Crimea. She was clearly. I know you mentioned as she got older with the French Revolution, she became maybe more reactionary and less interested in reform. But she was certainly seen as a great success in terms of building Russia as a great power, wasn't she?
I think this was an exciting time if you were a member of the nobility or the military elite or the church at that time. I think for the mass of peasantry, the support for the Pugachev revolt
Mm,
indicates that there was a lot of discontent. And of course, for Crimean Tatars, Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians who were being forced into this
sure.
empire, that this wasn't so appealing for them. So I think it depends on which sources we look at. And the Enlightenment's a great age of memoirs. So we have a lot of elite memoirs at this time period. So we tend to see this through the lens of Catherine the Great's courtiers and contemporaries of her own social class. But I think it's important to keep in mind that vast majority of peasantry
Of
who were
course.
bound to the land and who could be treated quite harshly
Yeah, dragged off for 25 years in the army. That's not good. That is not good.
yes, carried on for
That is not
25 years in the
enlightened.
army, forced to build in St. Petersburg. There was an enormous death toll in Peter the Great's time, in particular, because of the swampy land there and the disease
Mm,
that spread. That the city had been filled in to a much greater degree
no,
by Catherine the Great's time. But Catherine the Great saw herself as the successor of Peter the Great. She famously commissioned the bronze horseman statue that still stands in St. Petersburg from Catherine II to Peter I, where he's portrayed as a kind of Roman emperor emperor with the laurel leaves. And many portraits of Catherine as well have busts of Peter the Great there, that she viewed her grandfather-in-law as her true predecessor rather than her husband.
Okay, so we're getting towards the end of our time. I just wanted to a couple more questions, really. She herself, in the latter years of her life, did she look back on her life thinking that she had, achieved great things? Was she content? Was she happy, or was she disenchanted towards the end of her life?
Well, she had some difficulties later in her life. As I mentioned previously, her personal life begins to attract more scrutiny. The men who she was with earlier in her life all represented facets of her personality. There was Gregory Orlov, who involved in the military coup, the military leader, Gregory Potemkin, the statesman, Alexander Lanskoy, who was an art collector, Stanislaus Potianowski, who was the last king of Poland and an Enlightenment thinker in his own right, Sergei Saltykov, who was a courtier. But the later men in her life, who were much younger, were just viewed as ambitious courtiers. So when she was 60, her last lover, Platon Zubov, was about 20. And so she got a lot of mockery behind her back for that. Though, as you say, there were male rulers who certainly behaved this way. She had concerns over her son. There's evidence that she wanted to bypass him and have her grandson, who she'd raised, become Alexander the First. And in fact, Paul, like his possible father, Peter the Third, had a very short reign and was assassinated in 1801. He would only reign for 5 years, and he would pass the Pauline laws, which would ban female succession in Russia as long as there were any male dynasts, so
Oh, interesting.
members of the dynasty. So his issues with his mother were very much there in some of the legislation that
Wow.
he passed. So there were family troubles, and this is why we don't see reigning empresses after Catherine. Her son made sure that it was almost impossible for that to happen again. So she had family troubles. She had some personal troubles. But she looked back on her life as that she'd always tried to do what was best for her people and for Russia. So I think she recognized some very real accomplishments, even as she faced these difficulties in her later years, up until her death in 1796.
I mean, you've spent a lot of time in the company of these women, or the consorts. We've spoken about the empresses, the queens. Where does she rank, in your opinion, in terms of likability or interest?
Well, I think what's extraordinary is how she reinvented herself, that we have discussed so many royal consorts who had a lot of trouble identifying with their new country. Marie Antoinette, despite some efforts to learn French and throw herself into some of the social life of the French court, that Marie Antoinette was always seen as an Austrian, an envoy of the Habsburg court. But Catherine the Great, perhaps due to her own efforts to learn Russian and to embrace the Russian Orthodox Church, and perhaps simply because Anhalt Zverst was so insignificant that it wasn't viewed as a threat the way the Habsburg Empire might be viewed as a threat to France, that she was able to completely identify with Russia and set a lot of precedents that are still shaping some of the more unfortunate aspects of Russian foreign policy to this day. So it's rare that we get a royal consort where many people don't even know that Catherine the Great was of German descent. They see her
Mm.
as quintessentially Russian, and she's one of the few historical figures from that period in Russian history who many people can name. And a lot of the iconography of her reign continues to the end of Imperial Russia. The imperial state crown that she commissioned was worn by subsequent Russian rulers at their coronations, all the way up to Nicholas II, who was not happy having to wear this 9-pound crown on his coronation day when the earlier Muscovite crown was much more lightweight. And Nicholas II looked back to earlier traditions before Peter the Great. He tended to romanticize the old Russia, whereas some of the other 19th century Russian rulers, such as Nicholas II's grandfather, Alexander II, looked more to this European heritage and the influence that it had on Russia's history. So there's been an ongoing debate about Catherine's legacy, both as a European ruler and also over the course of Russian history.
I wonder if they had not stopped women from running the place, they may have had a better ending, these royals, because the men messed it up pretty badly, didn't they? And they all ended up dead. So I don't know. Who knows what would have
It,
happened? But
yeah, it's interesting to see what might have happened. The last Tsar's reign, Nicholas II, had a hemophiliac son, and he had four daughters. And there's some evidence Nicholas II was interested in changing the succession to allow
oh.
his daughters more prominence. But Nicholas had, a lot of uncles and male cousins who would not have been pleased with a change of that kind. So certainly by the time of the revolution, nothing had gone ahead. But every so often we see in one of those early 20th century memoirs a reference to Nicholas II asking about the succession. Would it be possible to reinstate women, particularly around the times when his son was particularly ill or when he was ill, that this seems to have come up. But World War I happens, the Russian Revolution of 1917. So we'll never know if Imperial Russia had lasted longer, if we'd see the kind of succession laws that are introduced elsewhere in Europe that allow women to succeed to the throne.
Well, wow. Thank you once again for such an amazing breadth of knowledge. People love the way you share your knowledge, and I certainly do as well. Yeah,
Happy to
your
be here.
enthusiasm for the subject is incredible.
What's
We've
fascinating
got to
would
think of
be
somebody else. We've done Marie Antoinette. We did Charlotte. Did we Carolyn? Charlotte? I've
yeah,
forgotten.
Carolina Brunswick.
Caroline. Now, Catherine, we've got to think of somebody else because this is very
Yes.
entertaining.
Yeah, we'll definitely work our way through the 18th and 19th centuries. There's so many interesting historical figures to discuss. And they're not simply historical figures, but multifaceted human beings. That there are biographies of Catherine the Great, like Robert K. Massey's Portrait of a Woman, that focus on her very much as a woman. And then we see Simon Sebag Montefiore's Catherine the Great and Potemkin, that look at this great partnership with Gregory Potemkin and that period of Catherine as a stateswoman, as well as her personal relationship with Potemkin. So there's so many books that have been written from different perspectives regarding Catherine the Great as both a person and as a ruler, and how
Well,
all
no, and
these
it's
books.
an era I love, the 18th century. I mean, maybe we need to find someone more British to talk about because I will get into all that stuff with Nelson and Trafalgar
Oh,
and
yes.
the sort of the long rivalry between Britain and France, which I've long been fascinated by and have indeed written on. Anyway, so good to talk to you. Thank you once again for your
Lovely
time.
talking to you.
Very much appreciated, and I will see you again really soon, I hope.
All right, talk to you again soon.
All the best, Karen. Bye.
Bye.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, again. What a wonderful interviewer you are. I don't know where you got all that knowledge, but I'm so glad that you share it with me. And I hope those of you who are watching or listening enjoy it too. We must get you back. We will get you back. So next week's show is going to be a bit different because I am going to be interviewed about, guess what? Yes, the book. Okay, I know it's not particularly scandalous, although there are things in it that I think are scandalous, and I will talk about those. But a lovely Mock O'Keefe, who has been a co-host now several times, and a guest, is going to we're going to swap roles. He is going to introduce me. He's got a copy of the book, or proof copy, and he's going to give me a grilling. And I'm not going to see the questions. And I have no idea. Mock and I do not see the world necessarily the same way, so I don't know what's going to happen. But it'll be interesting, and it's nice to be put on your toes, isn't it, and challenged. So that'll be fun. More traditional scandal type content coming up as well. Recently I made contact through Twitter with a really interesting writer, Tiffany Jenkins, who's got this really cool book out about privacy and intimate lives and the rise and fall of privacy, which is such an interesting subject. Everything from Victoria and Albert's stolen etchings, the relationship between Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, all the way to Harry and Meghan. What is private and what is not private, and should we mind that these boundaries have been eroded over the years? So that's going to be a really interesting conversation. That'll be soon. Some more World War II conversations, some more intelligence conversations, and a few more royal ones as well. But next week will be different and a little bit special. So I'm looking forward to that. Hope you enjoyed Carolyn. Do be in touch. Please like and subscribe if you're new, and I think some of you are because of Sathnam. And you like the show, just click that little subscription on YouTube, even if you're listening on audio. It really helps me. And yeah, you can also buy a mug. In fact, here's one. Well, that was my morning breakfast mug. Yes, I know. It should be Naughty Boy, isn't it? But I got this from Mrs. Craig as a present. Trust me, she's very naughty. All right, all the best. Thanks so much for your company once again, and bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.